Are the stars out tonight?
All right, y'all, so we're back here for part two. Last time we discussed, kind of got into a little bit of dispensationalism, pre-mill, Zionism. This time I want to kind of shift gears, talk a little bit about covenant theology, postmillennialism, amillennialism. And part of the reason I'm doing this is because I think it's helpful to see kind of like the different theological positions that are, I would say, they all have something going for them. They all fall under orthodoxy. They can't all be true, obviously, at the same time, because they have, various parts that are, opposed and contradictory to the other viewpoints. But I think, none of them are crazy. They all have historical root in kind of the Christian history. And they all, I think, just studying them can help you understand even your own perspective better. And then it can also help you understand how it plays into yours and other people's responses when issues like this happen with Israel, for instance, because they all kind of connect. They're like threads in a grand tapestry. So, anyways, hopping into that, I was thinking about an analogy. Just one that maybe it's not an analogy, but just a scenario that some of you may have faced. It's like you can imagine, like, if someone in their 50s just been a Christian a long time ago, it's just run of the mill evangelical Christian, and something happens with Israel, and they're just like, without knowing any of the details and not really even thinking through the issue much, they're just like, get the Israel flag out, and they're just gung-ho, and anybody that says they're from Israel, any leader or just movements in that direction, and they're just all on board. And that's kind of like the caricatured version of Zionism. But there are some people that fall toward that end of the spectrum where it's like for them to bless Israel and to be pro-Israel means to never have anything in the way of critique to say about anybody that is connected with Israel, or anything that the country does or leadership does, or to recognize sometimes the complexities involved with these types of issues. But then, they encounter the niece who's, third year university, could even be a Christian university these days, and they are, the opposite end of the spectrum, far out, just, pro-Palestine, because they're the oppressed, and Israel and the West has oppressed the Palestinians, and to the point that they're even, walking around with signs at their university, and even pro-Hamas. And so, you have these people, and you're like, in the case of this girl, she might have, little to zero knowledge of the history of, the modern state of Israel and the dealings with Palestine and any kind of degree of sophistication, yet, takes this strong position. And really what's involved in both of these scenarios is it's where I've kind of flattened it out to a caricatured version is the theologies driving them. In the one case, you have the theology of wokeness, the worldview of wokeness that frames everything so you really don't have to know any details. And on the other end, you might have a form of Zionism that just hasn't really been responsible with kind of a wise, more robust understanding of Zionism, where they could still stand with, for instance, for Israel, but still recognize, hey, what's this guy here is doing and saying, I disagree with that, but I still, stand with the nation, or, hey, yeah, there are some stuff going on over here that we might need to think through as we stand within, that kind of thing. So, what I want to jump into here is talking more about those theologies, and then kind of what's funding this other I think, group of Christians that might be new to both camps, and that is the group that, they are, at the end of the day, they're standing with Israel, but not on the basis of Zionism, but on the basis, in a given case, of what they would consider as just war theory, whereas they might not think that Israel has much or anything to do with end-time events and anything to do with Old Covenant Israel, the modern-day state of Israel. So, there's different things here that I think would help kind of clarify just having a basic understanding of these various perspectives. So let me go over here to covenant theology real quick and read this. So covenant theology is a doctrine or system of theology explaining the relationship between God and mankind in terms of a compact or covenant, also called federal theology. Theologians who have taught the covenant doctrine have based it on biblical themes, especially God's covenant with Israel as recorded in the Old Testament. Although the concept of covenant is ancient, the rigorous development of an overall systematic covenant theology grew out of the Protestant Reformation. The concept of a covenant, quote unquote, which is in Latin foedus, from which is derived federal theology, as it was generally understood at the time of the Reformation, meant a compact between two or more parties by which they solemnly obligated themselves to each other to accomplish a particular task. This concept was utilized as a theological construct by 16th century Reformed theologians, particularly John Calvin, 1509 through 1564, Ulrich Zwingli, 1484 to 1531, and Johann Heinrich Bullinger, 1504 to 1575. Anabaptists also developed a doctrine of covenant primarily referring to the union of believers with each other. Reformed covenant theology has taught that God offers grace and salvation to mankind. To those who by faith accept God's offer of salvation on his terms, he assuredly grants salvation. Thus, mankind gains assurance from its covenant relationship with God. Although there are many variations, theologians have discerned three covenants in Scripture: the covenant of works offered to Adam, which he failed; the covenant of grace offered after the fall of Adam, again to Abraham and renewed in Christ; and for some theologians, the covenant of redemption, the eternal promise of God's salvation underlying the covenant of grace. The covenant approach to theology strongly affected English Puritanism, and through Puritanism's influence in the New World, came to have a significant influence in America. One of the trademarks of Puritan theology, it is evident in the writings of such Puritan giants as Perkins, Fenner, Sibbes, Preston, Ames, and the separatist Brown. The appeal of the covenant among Puritans of England and America was varied, but most noteworthy was its rational and easily understood organizational structure. Moreover, the doctrine offered absolute assurance of God's eternal graciousness. Moreover, since many English and American Puritans were involved in the commercial and political world with its many compacts and contracts, the preachers' use of covenant contextualized theology in terms of their everyday world and spoke to them in a special way. Although Puritans did not invent covenant theology, they did make good use of it. The writings of William Ames, the English Puritan theologian and university professor, were an important means for spreading the covenant method of theology in both England and America. His Medulla Theologiae, 1627, known in many English editions as the marrow of sacred divinity, and his De Conscientia, 1630, present nearly the entire scope of theology within the framework of covenants. In dealing with intelligent creatures, man and woman, God governs in a moral, intelligent way through covenants. This covenant, he says, is, as it were, a kind of transaction of God with the creature whereby God commands, promises, threatens, fulfills, and the creature binds itself in obedience to God so demanding, unquote. First, God covenanted with Adam in the covenant of creation, which is the covenant of the works. He offered Adam, the public person, a bargain or conditional covenant saying, do this and you will live. If you do it not, you shall die. Adam failed, but then in the very dawn of human history, Genesis 3, God made his second covenant, the unconditional covenant of grace. The history of the new covenant is the story of salvation. Not all theologians developed the covenant idea in exactly the same way as Ames, but his exposition illustrates the main lines of the doctrine. Although European rather than American, Ames helped to mold American Puritan thought, and he was one of the forerunners of American Congregationalism. Many American settlers praised him as the learned doctor, and his Medulla and De Conscientia had a wide readership, with Medulla long serving as a textbook at Harvard and Yale. Through the English Puritan writers, covenant theology entered New England Congregationalism. American versions of it can be found in the writings of John Cotton, Thomas Hooker, Thomas Shepard, Peter Bulkley, and many others. Scottish Presbyterians also brought their distinctive covenant doctrine to America. Another source of the covenant ideal is the Westminster Confession of Faith from 1647, a theological creed revered by Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Baptists in both England and America. Outside of the Reformed tradition, however, the covenant concept was not nearly as prominent. Some Anabaptist groups, namely Amish, Hutterites, and Mennonites, drew upon their understanding of covenant in forming communal and mutual aid groups. So, in a nutshell, that's covenant theology. You can see that, there could be some overlap in the way of thinking about dispensations versus covenants, but these two run in opposite direction. You have, timeline-wise, this covenant theology developed basically in the, around the Reformation period, 1500s. They would say connects back. It's not that it was new, but it connected back. It was just a way of systematizing the biblical data in a very specific way. So, you could also argue that for the dispensational side, that even though that wasn't developed till, Darby in the 1800s and further by Dallas Theological Seminary, that it was just a systematization of what was already in the Bible to begin with. So, but that's where you'll want to dive in and say, okay, what is each system saying? What is the biblical data propping up each? Which one does a better job of explaining the biblical data and fitting them together in a systematic whole? And we systematic theology is necessary and it's good. It basically presupposes the idea that truth is coherent, and if it's coherent, then, if as you understand and they come together, truth should cohere together in a logical framework. And so systematic theology at its best tries to put together that framework in a way that does justice to biblical teaching and pulls it together in a way that can be understood and lived out consistently. So you see there, the Puritans had this covenant theology. They tended to be postmillennial as well. So I'm going to jump into that one before I read amillennialism. So postmillennialism, the belief that the return of Christ will take place after the millennium, which may be a literal period of peace and prosperity, or else a symbolic representation of the final triumph of the gospel. This new age will come through Christian teaching and preaching. The Holy Spirit will use such activity to shape a new world characterized by prosperity, peace, and righteousness. Evil will not be totally eliminated, but it will be reduced to a minimum because the moral and spiritual influence of the church will be greatly increased. During the new age, Christians will solve many of humankind's most persistent social, economic, and educational problems. The millennium will not necessarily be limited to 1,000 years because the number can be used symbolically. The period closes with the second coming of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, and the last judgment. Postmillennialism is often dismissed by premillennialists as a Christian version of the secular idea of progress, but it was actually formulated by Puritan theologians in the 17th century, long before the ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment popularized the belief in progress. The classic expression of postmillennialism is found in the work of Anglican commentator Daniel Whitby, who lived from 1638 to 1726. His view was adopted by many later Protestant ministers and theologians, including Jonathan Edwards, and the leaders of the Protestant missionary movement during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Despite the pessimism of recent times, postmillennialism continues to be popular among many of the Reformed churches. And so, you can see there the connection, postmillennialism and covenant theology in the Puritans, who, many argue laid the intellectual foundation really for what became the intellectual background for the founding of the nation. We interviewed Joe Boot, earlier this season, and he's got a book, the book we referenced called The Mission of God, where he really goes in depth of the Puritans and post-millennial theology. He is a post-mill guy as well, but argues that their vision of the mission of the church is what built the good parts of this nation, and then, basically pulling away from that into kind of a dualistic outlook, or maybe Gnostic outlook, or pietism and dispensationalism. Those kind of views really led us away from being salt and light in our culture, which is why, partially why we find ourselves in the trouble that we find ourselves in today. And that, that's part of, what Boot highlights and argues in his book and other books as well. So, so that's sort of like a real quick version of the post-mill theology. Amillennialism is, it's not too different from that, but let me read this, just a couple short paragraphs here. It says, the view that the 1,000 years of Revelation 21 through 10 is not a literal millennial rule of Christ on earth, but a symbolic reference to the period between the ministry of Christ and his second coming. Amillennialism teaches that there will be a continuous development of good and evil in the world until the return of Christ, when the dead shall be raised and the last judgment conducted. This interpretation emphasizes the present reality of the kingdom of God as Christ rules his church through the Word and the Spirit. There will not be a future perfect and glorious age until the establishment of the new heaven and new earth. Thus, Revelation 20 refers to the souls of the believers reigning with Christ in heaven. Continuing on, amillennialism was given its most influential expression in the writings of the church father Augustine. Okay, so he's links that with amillennialism rather than post. The eschatology of the early church was dominated by premillennialism, but with the excesses of Montanus, the allegorical interpretation popularized by Origen, and the legalization of Christianity by Constantine, the countercultural emphasis of primitive Christianity began to die out. Augustine's interpretation of the book of Revelation as referring to the church in its struggle with evil became the dominant view of Roman Catholic Christianity. The major Protestant traditions, including the Lutheran, Reformed, and Anglican, also accepted amillennialism, and such statements as the Augsburg Confession, the 39 Articles, and the Westminster Confession condemn premillennialism. Most of the leading churches of the 20th century follow amillennial eschatology. So, I would say probably most evangelical churches pre-mill, but if, you broaden it out to, I don't know, what we might call more mainline denominations and stuff like that, they would, then maybe you could get that number of amill advocates up. But, so that's just a quick walk through there on the overall view. So where does that leave us here? Why does it even matter? So let me try to pull this together here. So basically, if you're in the post-mill or amill camps, typically you're not going to be in the Zionist category, okay? So you're not going to connect Israel and the fulfilled promise of this land to modern Jews, that whole thing to Old Covenant Israel. You're not going to see a continuation between those two. If you're a pre-mill, especially dispensationalist, you are. So that's one reason you'll kind of see these different camps. What I want to do is recommend that you go listen to the following presentations. This will really help you understand kind of the systems in place even better. So I'm going to link these to the bottom in the show notes. So I think it would be well worth your time. These are really good in helping you understand the different eschatologies and how they connect with Zionism. So the first one's going to be, I'm going to send you one with Jeff Durbin. He's a pastor. You probably have seen him floating around on YouTube with Apologia. He was a hardcore dispensationalist, like, just maps on the wall, looking for newspapers, waiting for the third temple kind of guy. Now he's a post-mill advocate, and he just has a good way of explaining the differences and giving his perspective and kind of answering questions. How do you explain this passage? How do you explain that one? And why do you hold this view? That kind of thing. There's the next one is going to be Joel Webbin with Right Response Ministries. He's interviewing Andrew Isker, and they're talking about specifically a lot of the stuff with Israel from a post-mill perspective. I think they each have different views on Romans 11. I want to say Joel holds that there will be kind of this end time coming to Christ for all of Israel, the modern Jews, and whereas Andrew, I think, sees that as fulfilled in the first century. Before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. The third one I'm going to give you is Doug Wilson, where he's being interviewed by Remnant Radio, and I think those guys are pre-mill, but they're interviewing him on post-mill, and so they kind of ask him questions that you might think of if you were on that. Then I'm going to give you a discussion between three different guys, each arguing their own eschatological perspective. One is pre-mill, then Doug is the post-mill. There's a guy A-mill, and John Piper who's a pre-mill, is hosting the discussion. I'm also going to link John Harris interviewed an historian from Liberty University, specifically talking about Israel. They go into a lot of the geopolitical stuff as well, but they are both historic premillennialists. So John Harris, Conversations That Matter, I like a lot of his stuff. Interviewing the history professor from LU. Both of those guys are premill. And then just if you're interested in more like from the Zionist side, you can go, Michael Brown's got a book on Christian anti-Semitism on Amazon, or you can go to his Line of Fire website and just look up, Zionism, anti-Semitism, and he'll talk about, his critiques of replacement theology and all that kind of stuff. Now, with that, like Vodi Bakken, one of my favorites, he's an A-mill guy who says he lives post-mill. I think Sam Say, who we've had on the show, I believe he's A-mill. Post-mill is going to be, you got Douglas Wilson, Jared Longshore, Timon Klein, who I'm hoping to get on the podcast here in a little bit, A.D. Robles, guys like that, Cross Politic, those guys, post-mill, pre-mill, so many on that side, like I said, because that's sort of the default evangelical position. So most are going to be, that we would probably know of, are going to fall in that camp, including Biola, big pre-mill, all the profs there, people we've had on the show. Let's see, Elisa, Childers, the Impact. I think most of those guys, Sean McDowell, would hold to the pre-mill eschatology. So so if I'm weighing in on these things, what I would say, given those eschatologies, I would say no matter what position you land on, I would say live as a post-mill. So like Vodi says, he's an A-mill who lives like a post-mill, because the injunction to us in the Bible is not Jesus does talk about, understanding the signs of times, that kind of thing. And you can apply that as a pre-mill guide to the end of the age. But I think most historic pre-mill guys would admit that, even Jesus said, there were certain times, but even of his return, he doesn't even know the hour, the day or the hour. So what I would say is, like, getting caught up in that kind of theological speculation almost never benefits anybody, and it inevitably distracts from occupy until he comes to really fulfilling the Great Commission, which I would say is broader than just reaching souls. That's a whole nother discussion. But to be salt and light, at the very minimum, to be salt and light in the culture requires thinking long term and not thinking, that because another thing has happened that, in Israel, that the rapture is about to come. And I noticed that happening time and time again. It's very interesting. I read a book recently by Gary DeMar on end times. He's a post-mill, partial preterist, which is another topic that's typically connected to postmillennialism, about how to understand prophecies in the New Testament. But anyways, he has a whole chapter dedicated to all these hard predictions, starting maybe even before John Nelson Darby, but especially from Darby onward, with people just predicting, Jesus is coming back, and here's the signs, 88 Reasons Why He's Coming Back in 1988, huge book, the late great planet Earth, and just the impact that had on many people of having them disengage from the public square, from being salt and light in the society, which has contributed much to the reason things are so bad now. And so I think if recent history and just broad history and church history is any indicator, we should learn from it to not get caught up in trying to predict, if you hold to rapture theology, trying to predict this rapture and thinking that everything comes up, we need to run and just, run and hide, and thinking short term. Some people to the point where they don't even, think they want to have kids because, well, things are just going to get worse and worse. They're starting to implant the chips now. So, and this is just, I think this runs against good, solid biblical theology, going all the way back to the cultural mandate of being fruitful and multiplied, taking dominion, being salt and light. That needs to be the first priority and emphasis. And then if you, want to think through the prophecy stuff is behind that, fine, so be it. But don't let that block you, and don't let it become this thing where, man, every time something happens, I'm noticing that, like the messages that happened that Sunday at many dispensational churches, it was just so, just badly predictable, and just continues to lull people to sleep, where what we need to do right now, I really truly believe, man, is to rise up as the church and apply the teachings of Christ to, discipling the nations. Part of that is teaching the nations to obey all that he's commanded, starting with learning it ourselves, our families, spreading out, to people we have influence, to taking the ways of God that are taught throughout all of Scripture and applying them to life. So that's one aspect that I would say. Then I would say, like, for our Zionist brothers and sisters, again, I don't have a strong view on this point yet. Still kind of assessing all the different reasons for and against it. But at this point, what I would say is just, we got to be careful applying that in a way where everything that Israel always does is right. And so even for the Zionists, I think Michael Brown, for instance, would even agree with that. Like, you can be a Zionist and still recognize that certain governmental systems have been infiltrated, that there's certain leaders who are wicked. There's certain things that they do wrong, certain things they do right. Now that if you can put aside the idea here that I'm trying in any way to make a moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas, that's not the case at all. I'm just saying, like, you have to have a realistic, even as a Zionist, have a realistic understanding of the people and the leaders within Israel as you stand with them, and as you kind of take up for them based on this theology, that know that no matter what, this is their land. We stand with them in the same way, really, that you can stand for America. Like right now, you could say, man, I'm for America as an American. I want to see America flourish. But I think that, the people that are in charge are really wicked and evil and doing some bad things, and we're trying to, stand up against their actions and get things back on track. Now, I'm not saying anybody in Israel fits that category. I'm just saying, in theory, you have to be open to that kind of discussion. We're saying, like, man, yeah, I stand with Israel, but this and that person, this Mossad or whoever, Netanyahu, this and that. You don't have to whitewash everything just because you stand with Israel. That would be my only thing to the Zionists is understand the nuances and the complexities involved, even as you take your theological stand. And then, with the guys that are like against it, I think against Zionism and all that kind of thing, I think that sometimes there's been too much of just a brass againstness and taking a lack of care with the historical complexities as well, and the emotions that can be, that are attached to this, because basically, like, for instance, I think Nikki Haley tweeted this today. She said to not be a Zionist is to be an anti-Semite, and that's just completely false. Like, and you'll see that if you watch any of the post-mill guys that I recommended that are not Zionists, I think to a number they would all agree that in this particular case with Hamas coming in with Israel, and just in general, like in history, because Israel tends to operate out of a Christian framework of just law theory, whereas you have Hamas and those guys who are not operating from that ethical place at all. They would end up standing with Israel, just not for the theological reasons that Zionists would. So I think to a number, all of these guys would say that, especially in this particular case we're in, Israel would not be in the wrong to respond with strength and to basically, really, really do what they have to do to overcome this thing with Hamas and to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future. How that all happens and how much we're involved with that, they would have different things to say. But, and to that Nikki Haley statement is just patently false. It's blatantly false, demonstrably false. And sometimes I wonder if Brown borders on that idea, but maybe he doesn't. But I do think that we have to understand that to not be a Zionist is not to be an anti-Semite in any case. Now, you do have, obviously, all anti-Semites would not be Zionists. So, sort of like the logic of, all bears are animals, but not all animals are bears. So all anti-Semites would be anti-Zionists, but not all non-Zionists would be anti-Semites. And many in that camp, like I said, are not. So that will hopefully give you a picture. Now we're going to talk more about the religion that's, our young people being indoctrinated and why it lends itself to sort of the opposite side, where they're promoting kind of blindly in many cases Palestine and even Hamas in some cases. And so with little to no understanding of any of the issues involved, but it's based on their religion of wokeism. So again, dispensationalists, live like post-mills as much as possible. Think, generations down the road and occupy till he comes, prep and plan and just live out the Christian faith, apply it to every area of life. Zionists, understand the complexities. Non-Zionists understand the complexities. And I think, as we're praying for these issues, we all could stand to learn and grow about the things that are involved. Next time, I think what I want to do is get into just a little bit of just war theory and what it is, and so that even if you don't have necessarily theological commitments toward or against Zionism, you can begin to think through it from a Christian general perspective of like how should nations respond to violence, and when is war just, and what means of war are just, and then you can at least have a framework to start from, and then after that maybe we'll go into a little bit. I don't know how far we'll go into that, but the particulars of this scenario that's currently going on. So anyways, like I said, check out the links below. And I'd love to hear back from you if you do get a chance to listen to some of these things that I'm recommending. Let me know what you think about it. All right. Thanks again for joining us for this week's or this episode of Free Mind Podcast, and we'll see you next time.